people kind of think like a tool will change behavior. The American economy is built atop the idea that a tool will change behavior. That's why there's all these treadmills gathering dust, right? That's not how it works. Your behavior changes behavior. And so when people ask for tools, they're sort of asking for shortcuts to how to change behavior.
Welcome back to the Insights by Design podcast. We are thrilled to be joined with Conor Grennan. Conor, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, guys.
We're absolutely thrilled that you joined us today. Thank you so much. And for Conor, for those who don't know you from your TikTok, your YouTube, and your LinkedIn, would you mind just giving a quick background?
Yeah, it might be too much. So I'm Conor Grennan, and I'm at the NYU Stern School of Business, and I'm a Chief AI Architect there, which is a fairly new role. I've been doing generative AI there for about a year, but I'm just sort of transitioning out of 10 years of Dean of Students for the MBA program there, and I've been I had started this generative AI initiative about a year ago, and the school and I wanted to really formalize it, so we're getting deeper into that. But that's where I am now.
Well, let's trace some of your professional journeys, starting with your work as Dean of Students. What initially attracted you to that role?
Yeah, it's a great role. Like, it's especially on the graduate side. We were sort of saying before we got on, like, it's, MBAs, like the issues MBAs have are all, very adultish issues, which is great. I got attracted to that role, and I sort of just fell into it, as I'm sure so many of us fall into so many things. So I got my MBA from NYU Stern back in 2010 or so. And at the time, I was kind of going into finance, but I ended up going into writing, which is very strange for an MBA student, maybe. But I spent the next few years just kind of writing and speaking for a living. And that was really fun. But it's, even for a huge introvert, I act like an extrovert, but I'm actually a huge introvert. And so even for me, it was a little bit of a lonely, solitary life. And I'd been doing a lot with NYU Stern. I'd been kind of coming back and talking about just various things with classes and things like that. And then at some point they were like, "Hey, like, this role is opening. Would you have any interest in this role?" And that's kind of how it started. And that was 10 years ago.
And then a philosophical follow-up question. What has the role of Dean of Students taught you about human nature?
Oh boy, that is a good one. I'm trying to let me think. So there's, the humans. It's funny. So I think when we think about human nature, we sort of talk about like observing other humans, but I think we have to observe ourselves as humans as well. So I'll say two things. One is that when people are upset about something, it's very rarely the thing that they're upset about, if that makes sense. So people would come in and sort of like be trying to fix something. I think that there is a need as humans to try to fix something that's right in front of you, something you can kind of get your hands around. So if you're going through like a rough patch, like, when my desk is clean, it means that I'm going through a rough sort of like thing professionally or something like that. I'm like, well, at least I know I can clean my desk. So when students come in with like, we just have to change this policy on blah, blah, it's like something that they can actually kind of like tangibly do. It always, it took me a little while to figure this out, but I started to realize that there was actually something below that. Do you know what I mean? Like, something else is going on in their life that often, like 90% of the time, that was much harder to fix. You know what I mean? So I kind of, we kind of talked about that thing that they came in for, but then I really very quickly got to like, so what else is happening? You know what I mean? Like, and so that's one thing about human nature, is that I think we just like I think we have a tendency to really want to solve more solvable things. And the other thing is that I think people really respect truth and integrity and straightforwardness. Now, we can say duh, but I think that at the root of the difficulty around having difficult conversations is that, you're afraid to tell people things. You know what I mean? Like, you're afraid to sort of like share the truth about things. And I learned to have really difficult conversations in that role. And what I learned was that as much as I wanted to beat around the bush and put the ball in their court and say like, well, are you sure you even want to do that? And all that kind of stuff. I found a lot more success, and this took a long time, just in saying, hey, this is the situation. So this is the reality. So now let's talk about what we can do and how we can kind of deal with that reality. And as a natural people pleaser, I think that was hard for me at first. But then I realized that on the human nature aspect of that, it's people still run to sort of like they ultimately just they want to hear what's true and then kind of like move on. So I mean, that is sort of like how I've gotten better at having like difficult conversations around that.
And you're moving from focusing on people to focusing on technology. And AI can really be portrayed as, focusing on the imminent doom of our robot overlords. But
Terminator.
you've had a lot of time supporting people and their human journey. And one of the most interesting things that I think we uncovered when we were looking at your history is you're the founder of Next Generation Nepal. Would you mind just giving us a little bit of background and insight into that?
Yeah. So Next Generation Nepal. It's an organization that I started a long time ago. I guess probably 2006 maybe, or something like that. Super quick story. I was living abroad for about 11 years in Prague and Brussels. I ended up taking a trip around the world for a year. Ended up in Nepal and ended up taking care of all these kids through volunteer work, and then kind of fell in love with that work very much to my surprise, and ended up sort of like starting an organization that was kind of helping to rescue trafficked kids and reunite them with their families. We're now at a stage where we're trying to kind of move that into a more local organization, sort of like kind of like eventually it's been a long process of kind of like trying to close down the western part of that, if that makes sense, and really have it kind of like owned locally. But that was an amazing experience, right? Like that was very human focused. I lived in Nepal for quite a while, and was just trying to help these kids. And so the interesting thing for me was that, first of all, I wrote a ton about it, and that I ended up writing about it more formally. But also, it just really gets you out of your head, and it kind of, I don't mean puts things in perspective, like, oh, we have so much here in America and they don't. I don't really mean like that. I guess I just mean like, um, you realize like how much you can endure and survive, and how things just aren't the end of the world, and how everything is relative. I mean, it's no matter what, you just sort of like have to take what you've been given in life and just roll with that. I mean, like I see kids in very poor areas of the world, and there's a lot of joy in those kids. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't be happier if they had more access to medical attention and food and things like that. I don't mean that, but I having spent a lot of time with them at this point, I guess I just sort of see, there's no like finish line. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no like, oh my gosh, if I just get to this point in my life, everything is going to be okay. It is a wide, wide scale. And I think that for me, understanding that everybody just, you sort of like have to kind of roll with the journey that you're on and sort of like take you, and not think like, oh my gosh, if I just kind of like am able to do this, then everything will be fine. I think Nepal and, doing that kind of work really, really taught me that.
And how would you say that your time in Nepal impacted your professional trajectory?
Yeah, I think it impacted it a lot. I mean, I think that it taught me that you can well, a couple of things. I think number one is that you can sort of just handle anything that comes. Do you know what I mean? You're just like, you know what, this is going to be okay. We are going to get through this. That's number one. But I think even more importantly, in a way, I mean, that's sort of like the very, very broad. But I think sort of the more tactical one is uh, was understanding that so much conflict and misunderstanding, all that kind of stuff, comes because we tend to think that our culture is superior. And I don't mean that you walk into a place and be like, my culture is superior. I mean that in a very sort of like quiet, almost more nefarious kind of way, in that, when I would go into a place like Nepal, and I would, and I was kind of coming from, a Western perspective, and I was just like, this is better than this. Like objectively, having doing things this way is better than this way. You know what I mean? Like playing with a real toy is better than playing with trash. As an easy example, right? But in fact, is it? Because I mean, the real toy is going to break, and it's just a toy. It's just using your imagination, and with kind of like trash or things that they found, the kids were actually like really imaginative and innovative and things like that. It just kind of like flipped my thinking around. Gosh, I am really, really accustomed to walking into a place and thinking, this is how I've always done it, and this is the best way to do it. And I think the thing that I'm still trying to get better at today is this idea of like, okay, let me hear why these people, or why this new team, or why this organization, or whatever, does it this way. And let's like just really take it, as it comes, and sort of hear like, okay, they're doing it this way for this reason. Now, that's not to say that there's not potentially better ways to do it, all that kind of stuff. But I think we're so quick to come in and say, well, this is how I've always done it. So I think that the radical way, the thing that I've learned from Nepal was coming into a radically different culture around, how people are taught and how people talk to each other and how people interact, all that kind of stuff. And I'm just like, this is bad that people are so crushed together on this bus or whatever. I'm like, well, why? Well, intrinsically, why? Do you know what I mean? Like it really kind of like got me thinking, like questioning deep held beliefs just about how the world should be and actually opening myself up a little bit.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Andrew and I have both lived abroad as well, and there's really nothing like getting outside of your traditional cultural boundaries to learn cultural humility and cultural
Yeah.
awareness in a way that a
Yes.
classroom can never teach you. And that's such a valuable professional skill that I think you can only get by going abroad, doing service, and trying to make the world a better place in a way that fits for the local population, working with them rather than on top of them or against them.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's a great way to say it. Humility is a great word in that respect because it means is that you're walking into a new situation, not having your mind made up, and and when they have when they talk about psychologically safe teams and things like that, it sounds like a very sort of like loosey goosey type word and all that kind of stuff, but really all it means is like, are you open to hearing different ideas, and do you kind of like respect those ideas no matter where they're coming from? I mean, it's funny, the other there that certainly happens when you live abroad. I totally agree. It certainly happens when you live in cultures that can be quite, and actually really every culture is quite different. It's a sliding scale. And now I'm discovering it with my kids, right? I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And it's funny, like, so for so long, if you have kids, you kind of think, oh, well, I know the best way. And my son, who's very patient with me, who's 15, is like, Dad, I really think this is the better way to do it. And I'd spend my entire life being like, no, it can't possibly be. But now I realize it's, even that requires more humility.
And even in technology, AI gives us the tendency to abstract away a lot of ideas and to remove us from the human element. What are some ways that you try to keep humans in the loop as you think about your AI strategy?
Yeah, it's the human in the loop. It's the way you describe it, and it's exactly the right way. And I think sometimes saying human in the loop, people can it can kind of go in one ear out the other, but it really is the way to describe it. Do you know what I mean? Like you need to keep a human in the loop. And so what I've really discovered over the last year has been really, really startling to me, which is, people are hearing about AI and generative AI and all that kind of stuff, and that's what I do now. But the framework that I built really became more and more human. So in other words, when I started this, I kind of discovered generative AI like everybody else did, and I was like, holy cow, like what is this thing, and at first didn't really know how to use it, and then I kind of took a deep dive and immediately sort of saw like, okay, this is clearly going to change everything, and so how do we teach our MBA students? That was, and again, just as a dean of students, I was like, we have to do this. Who's doing this? And the only people doing it were doing it from a very machine learning type background, like a super high tech background. Do you know what I mean? Like sort of like, well, how did this work? How do neural networks work? Like, what's the programming behind it? Like, what is the software? How does it? What's the what is it? How do tokens sort of like predict what? All that kind of stuff. And I was like, but that's not what I'm sensing when I'm using things, large language models and things like that. Like, I'm just talking to it like a human, and I don't have a tech background. So what's happening here? And so every time I would sort of, I kind of built out this framework, and the first framework I built out was, a 3-part framework, kind of like use cases, basic to advanced. And I would go out to companies and say, hey, how are you using this? Because I really want to teach our students. And the answer kept coming back, well, we're not really using it. I was like, oh, well, it's pretty powerful. You should check it out. And they were like, well, how are you using it? And I'm like, well, I'm teaching our students, blah, blah, blah. So that's how I sort of like started on this. And so they asked me to come in and, kind of consult with them and teach them how to do it. So I would do this with pretty large, hedge funds and asset management firms and things like that. And the crazy thing about it was that even though in the moment it would actually go really, really well, these workshops, and they were like, this is going to change everything, it wasn't sticking. And so, I would kind of come back, and they were still like using the same use cases that I'd given them and things like that. And I was like, what's happening here? And that's for me was the human in the loop moment. That was, to me, was the moment where I was like, okay, there's something wrong here, because you don't actually need any technical ability to work with generative AI, like at all, like zero technical ability. And if that's the case, then that means there's pretty much zero learning curve, or there's the same amount of learning curve as you'd have in, weight loss or something. Like weight loss, we know, eat less and exercise. There's no learning curve there. It's a behavioral change. And I was starting to realize, I don't think that this is a digital transformation. I think this is like a change management thing, right? And it totally changed how I teach now. It totally changed the framework that I built out, and it really changed the focus to not just let's force the human back in the loop, but having people really understand, like, this actually, this doesn't start with tech. It starts with you. Like, what do you need to do? And then bring this on. Because if it was just tech, if it was just, a Salesforce or ServiceNow or, or Excel, everybody would learn it and then everybody would be using that tool. But it's not that. It's everybody uses it in ways that are so specific and individual to them, because it's an augmentation of how a human works and thinks. And so I think keeping a human in the loop it's like keeping a heart in a human body. I mean, like it needs it, because it's the only thing that's augmenting off. It's not doing something by itself.
Wow, what a metaphor. Keeping a human in the loop is like keeping a heart in a human body. Well, given that importance.
Just came up with that, by the way. I got to write that down somewhere. Anyway, go ahead.
I can really see that. I can almost feel that metaphor. That's powerful. I was going to ask, since you really have your finger on the pulse of AI, to continue the cardiovascular references, what about AI makes you the most excited and the most nervous?
Yeah. Well, I think let's start with the most nervous. I think the most nervous is just how, well, actually, kind of a couple of things. First of all, how radically unpredictable the future is at this point. I don't know how you can't be a little nervous about, the idea of AGI, or artificial general intelligence, when these things essentially think for themselves and make decisions for themselves. That's coming. I don't think there's any way to say it's not coming. So what does that actually look like? I mean, at some point we'll be sitting here doing this podcast and we'll be like, well, now we know, but it's such an incredible mystery to me. And even the people creating it don't really know. And that obviously makes me, I'm not worried about it in a sense of like, I think it's going to go wrong. I just don't know. And, and that can cause some apprehension. I think the deep fakes, I don't know if there's a better word for it now. I mean, like, because clearly with imagery and with voice, with things like 11 Labs and Midjourney on the imagery and Runway and Sora and all these things, it's very difficult to tell real from fake, and that makes me nervous for, especially for like our more like aging population, our population that isn't well versed on this. Like, how would they even know? Do you know what I mean? Like, if they hear sort of like a voice on the other end of the line, I mean, people like us who sort of like probably know this space a little better, maybe, you can sort of say like, oh, I think this is a chatbot, but like all like the amount of people that can be taken advantage of, that makes me really nervous. You know what I mean? Like, sort of like, especially again, like our kind of like older populations, so that makes me really nervous about scams. But gosh, I got to say that the good for me really outweighs it. I tend to be an optimist around this stuff, like kind of a big time optimist. And the thing that I get really excited about is just how this is going to impact everybody's lives. I mean, like, this is the interesting thing, right? It's the, the analogy I give is it's sort of like more like electricity than anything else, right? It's like electricity will impact every part of your life, but you need to know what you want to do. And so I think people right now are kind of taking AI and saying like, well, what can I do with AI? And I'm like, well, that's not necessarily the right question to ask. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, well, what do you do? Like, what drives value in your business, or what drives value for you, or what are you trying to do at home, or what are you trying to do with your kid? Like, whatever it is. In the same way, nobody wakes up and is like, how am I going to use electricity today? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just like in front of you. Do you know what I mean? Like, right now we are using electricity in like 5 different ways on this conversation, but we're not thinking like, oh, the power of electricity. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, and generative AI is kind of like that. Like, it really depends on what you need to do. And what's exciting to me is that at some point, my theory on this is, and after a year of research, is that like it's the user interface that's causing so many problems. Because if AI looked like Jarvis from Iron Man, or Data from Star Trek, or C-3PO or something, people would have no problem talking to it and actually getting what they needed out of it. But I think the user interface really holds back the brain, because the way neural pathways work and sort of like automating things. So it kind of like you kind of think it's Google instead of this. Anyway, that's a part of my framework that I teach. But I think the thing that gets exciting for me is that, especially thinking about very rural areas or remote areas, I mean, people are like, oh, don't use it as a doctor. I'm like, what are you, out of your mind? Of course, use it as a doctor. Like, I mean, like, you can take a photo of something happening on your body and you can sort of say, like, what's happening here? And it'll give you a pretty good answer. Or you can, use it sort of like, hey, I'm trying to learn biology. Like people who didn't have access to tutors. It's just accessibility to things that, typically the wealthy only had access to, and you have access to it in your pocket is incredible to me.
And you brought up a couple of important points. And I was meeting with the CTO of Oklahoma the other day, and he brought up a strong point about, as you noted, AI can be a human problem and that it's so easy for people to lose trust in the AI depending on their interactions with it. What are some of your core principles around effective AI UX design?
Yeah, I think AI UX design has so far mostly been really awful, and I think that's because the people who understand it just understand it and assume everybody else is going to understand it. And so I guess what I mean by that is like, I would want, like, if I was learning how to play basketball, I wouldn't want Michael Jordan teaching me because he's like, just do this, just, you know what I mean? Like it's so ingrained and those neural pathways in it are so deep that they don't even really know what they're doing. Do you know what I mean? Like they just, if you see it, you see it. Do you know what I mean? Like, and the problem with something like ChatGPT is that you'll talk to people who are using it 50 times a day. And then somebody who's not using it will sort of say like, well, how do you use it? Try explaining that. It's like, just use it for anything. And people are like, well, like how? Well, like anything, So I think with user design, the huge problem is that it looks like a text box. And when your brain sees a baby, it doesn't have to say, I got to speak to this like a baby and not a college professor. It just knows. And when your brain sees glowing red metal, it doesn't think like, well, should I touch that or not? It just knows. And when your brain sees a text box that looks and acts kind of like Google, it just knows to sort of use it like Google, which is the wrong way to use it. And that is a typical and extremely impactful bad user design. Now, I don't have a better design, by the way. I mean, I do, but it would involve sort of like literally like a humanoid kind of like talking person kind of thing. But that would get very weird, I think, very quick. So I don't know, but I know I think that the stumbling block to everybody using generative AI is in the user design. It's not in the tool. It's completely and 100% in the design. And if you think about it, like, what's generative AI? Generative AI is just essentially ripping the user interface off AI. I mean, we use spell check all the time, right? But nobody thinks like, well, how do I use spell check? It's just, it shows up. Oh, this word must be misspelled. That's a great user design. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so the user design right now is kind of backdooring it a little bit, which is, it's building it's almost like taking the user design that you already know, like in Canva or something like that, and building AI into the background. So now that user design that you already are familiar with, it's just doing it better. But to have a real AI user interface, I don't think that code has been cracked yet. And I think that that's a big stumbling block.
So I think we could say that part of keeping a human in the loop is not just the tech pro who can weigh the pros and cons of the AI tool and help match it to the job. It's also keeping the end user in the loop so that the tool can serve a wider population and democratize the technology and hopefully make the world a better place. We can't forget about the end users. So I wanted to ask, what is your guiding ethical philosophy when it comes to AI implementation?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say for me, the way that I do it, and so again, like I'm going to be very biased toward the way that I teach, right? So I have kind of my consulting from like AI Mindset, which is, so I like have a weekly newsletter where I write about this stuff all the time, and I go out and I train companies. I'm kind of on the road pretty much every week, training companies, as well as doing my work at NYU. And so the way that I've been in front of thousands and thousands of people at this point and talked to thousands and worked with dozens and dozens of big companies. And so all this is just iterative. Do you know what I mean? Like all this is just like trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. But what I found is that people need a paradigm. You know what I mean? Like, and so the paradigm that, I try to like break down the paradigm, the bad paradigms, and then try to build up a new paradigm for them in terms of like, what is your philosophy when you're encountering this thing? Like, how should you be using it? Assuming that, you trust it and all that kind of stuff. And that's a different that's a different conversation, of course. But in my mind, you have to break down this old mold of why are we using it incorrectly? Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think we're using it incorrectly. I talk about this a lot because our brains don't really know what this thing is, and it doesn't really replace anything, and that's problematic for the brain. And when you're talking about user design, like, everything, like, the hammer replaces the rock. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it kind of like looks like this kind of thing, right? Like, you just kind of like know instinctively what things replace. So my philosophy on sort of like getting people to use and interact with it correctly is to first sort of shine a spotlight on what we're doing wrong. So in other words, like, if I was trying to get in shape and I bought like a treadmill, right? Like, I'd get on that treadmill and 5 minutes later I'd get off the treadmill. But it's not because there's something wrong with the treadmill and I don't need to read the user manual or something, right? It's because, like, the way my brain works is that it prioritizes quick rewards and rest. And, a couch and a bowl of Doritos does that, right? Like, the treadmill doesn't do that. So my philosophy on sort of like helping people understand this is like, let's understand like why in this analogy you're out of shape, right? It's because you have bowls of Doritos everywhere. And because, like, you just kind of think that you're not on the treadmill because you don't have time. But those aren't the reasons. The reasons are because your brain is like trying to gear itself towards survival and survive. You know what I mean? Like, there's different reasons from the reasons that we think. So I try to shine a spotlight on what's going wrong. And then I try to sort of like build up new paradigms. Like, okay, now let's look at it this way. And that's how I work with companies to try to get entire teams sort of like leveled up on this.
And with you being so busy, your wife is also incredibly busy being a partner at a prestigious consulting firm. As you noted, you have 2 teenagers. What's your strategy for balancing, your demanding careers with, personal life and satisfaction?
Yeah. If you have any ideas, I mean, I am open.
We were coming to you for ideas, Conor.
Here's what I would say, I guess. Yeah, so my wife's a partner at McKinsey. She does responsible AI there. I think that we've been extremely fortunate in that we've been able to work from home quite a bit, and so we're kind of like around our kids. But it is very, very busy. I will say this. I think that for us, what we've determined is that, like, there has to be a time and a place for the busy. It can't just be constant. And so, in the past year, especially from, whatever, early spring last year until like the end of the year, I was just going nonstop because I was like everybody else. I'm trying to learn this stuff. And there's not really any place to learn it unless you are experimenting yourself. I mean, people are like, well, what, books and stuff like that are out there. It's like, no, man, you got to go to like, Twitter or X or whatever. Like, you have to, or test these things out yourself. So it's just very, very busy. But I think that, my wife and I, Liz and I kind of had this conversation around like, okay, this can't be the norm. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's okay to sort of like go in spurts, and because the kids go in spurts too, right? They have like, exams, and they have times where they're playing sports and all that kind of stuff, and they're doing the play. Like, we all go in spurts, but then we have to sort of like carve out time. So what we've tried to do is actually kind of like calendarize time. And I know that sounds awful, but like, just like carve out time on the calendar to be like, hey, this is when we're actually just like together and chilling out and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, things bleed into one. It's not like the old days where you'd leave the office and that was it, right? I mean, who works like that anymore, right? I mean, like, it's a good thing and a bad thing, I mean, like, because you have more control of your schedule, but like your schedule is now all encompassing. So we've tried to be really purposeful about like carving out specific times. Otherwise, it will just be all encompassing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my family, we certainly don't have this down, but we find that if we can sit down around the family dinner table at night and at least enjoy a meal together, that's a good start to creating boundaries and help keeping back the pressures of the day. But this is certainly a work in process for us too. But speaking of being busy, you create articles. We talked about your memoir of Nepal. You post almost daily content to LinkedIn, YouTube videos, and most recently you became an accidental TikTok star. So what content medium do you find the most natural, and which do you find the hardest?
I love that question. Because it's sort of like writing, right? Like, when I write nonfiction, it comes so naturally and easily. I love it. And fiction, I like writing it, but I find it very, very hard. So I've gotten really comfortable around LinkedIn, and I think it's because I don't have to be so precious around it anymore. I try to be informative. I do post pretty much every day on LinkedIn. That's kind of like my storefront in a way. I really like YouTube, but it's all the stuff around YouTube. It's like uploading stuff, and it's like creating a thumbnail. And like, and like I edit all my own videos and all that kind of stuff, and it's exhausting, right? So like, that's a little challenging. So I like the YouTube format, I really do, but I get like really nerding out on like lighting and sound and all that kind of stuff. But I gotta say, like, yeah, I started TikTok 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and I was just like, you know what the heck? I'm just gonna like record something in my phone, and that was really fun. It was just like a minute and a half of like, hey man, this is how I'm seeing the world right now. Like this is like blah 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 blah. And I found that really, really fun. And suddenly, like, and by the way, blowing up on TikTok is utterly accidental. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like, it just like there's no rhyme or reason to it. I think I'm posting good content on there. I mean, I'm posting sort of like, hey, here's some tips on ChatGPT over and over and over and over again. I think people need to know that. I really do believe that. But I think that form of putting stuff up there is great. Like Instagram. I have a hard so I just kind of post that kind of stuff to Instagram. I don't love putting up like photos of me and my family and stuff like that on Instagram. So that was never natural. I don't like consuming the content, to be totally honest, on TikTok or Instagram. So that's a little strange. So, and also I like writing the news. So I write a weekly newsletter that goes pretty deep on like, hey, here's how you have to think about this. And here's how you're going to change yourself, your company, all that kind of stuff. Not just like there's news in there too, AI news, just to sort of like, let's keep up together. But it's not just news. It's like, let's think about this differently. And I like that too, because it gets me thinking about like, how should I think about it differently? So we were talking about this before as well, before the podcast. Like when you're doing things yourself, it sort of spurs you to learn it. And I really like that element of it.
Fascinating. And you're putting out so much great content. And I think it really resonates with a lot of people. And one of the things that you're really great at with our mutual friend Jaden Schaefer is keeping up with all of the AI news and the tools that come out. So what we want to do, Conor, is we want to give you a lightning round where we'll give you a task and you tell us which AI tool you would use for that task.
Do it.
All right. Help writing a blog post.
I used to say ChatGPT and now I say Claude 3, Anthropic's tool.
Brainstorming TikTok ideas.
So I know this is lightning. I have to tell you this story. I'm so sorry.
Oh, please.
I asked like
so
TikTok. So on TikTok ideas, I was using ChatGPT. I tried Claude because Claude was so good with newsletters. So I was like uploading old newsletters to Claude and saying like, "Hey, I'm trying to write. Here's my rough draft. Can you make it more sound like me?" And it was doing such a phenomenal job. I wish I could show you this. And I got to do a YouTube on it. So I tried that with the TikTok videos, right? And I did that. I'm like, hey, just give me like 5 more TikTok scripts or ideas or whatever, just to sort of see how it would do on Claude. Claude refused. Claude was like, the way you're talking about AI is just too sensational. I refuse. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. It's like, no, I'm not going to do this. Like, this is like, you should just talk about facts. I'm like, I'm on TikTok, man. I'm not just going to talk about facts. It's like, well, I think that's going to be better. I'm like, are you out of your mind right now? Like, I'm talking about this in this way because AI, like when people don't know about it, I have to sort of like speak more exuberantly about it because otherwise people are not going to use it. And I really genuinely think it's going to make their life better. And Claude was like, I understand your point, but I still think that can be accomplished, blah, blah, blah. So, and like doing this. And then I literally quote, I'm like, sheesh, man, then do it. Like I asked you for help and you're just giving me this giant lecture. And it was like, sorry, you're right. I'm getting a little preachy. How about if we do? Anyway, it was an amazing conversation. So with TikTok ideas, I still think Claude, but Claude is now mad at me around TikTok. So I don't think I would use Claude. I think I'd go back to ChatGPT. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it was an amazing.
Does Claude keep grudges? Like, oh, I remember you from a week ago. I'm still mad.
Look, you want to test that out? I don't know.
Claude, and I know this is the lightning round, but since we're doing a slow lightning strike, I use Claude 3 a lot, but my issues with it are it runs out of tokens, like your allotment of tokens, super fast, way faster than GPT-4. And it tells me that my chats get too long and it asks me to erase it, where GPT-4 goes forever. But you're right. I love the tone.
That's why I've never had that with Claude. In fact, so I do a lot of workshops with companies, and I actually have had it happen now a couple of times with GPT-4, where and it's happening, I think, because I'm uploading giant spreadsheets to show people Code Interpreter and things like that. And in fact, I've now opened a second ChatGPT 4 account, paying another $20 a month just as a backup. Because if I'm in front of people, I can't, like, that can't happen. You know what I mean? Like if I'm training a company. But that's happened to me a couple times with GPT 4 actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Back to the lightning round.
Yeah.
Back to the lightning.
Research for an upcoming presentation.
Perplexity. I find Perplexity. I also want to give some love to U.com. I think they're an absolute phenomenal company. I'm just a little more accustomed to Perplexity at the moment. But the reason that for that is that it will not only draw a ton of research out, but it'll put it into a rough draft of what you need. And Perplexity, if you're using Google search and not using Perplexity or U.com, you have to switch over.
Planning a meal using only what you have in the fridge.
ChatGPT for sure. It's so good at it. I mean, either I'll sort of take a picture with Vision, or I'll just sort of say like random stuff, and it is phenomenal. And we have to do that, right? We have to do a ton of meal planning in our house. It is amazing at it.
Coding a web application.
I don't know. I don't have to code web applications, so I'm going to pass on that. I have no idea.
Creating a thumbnail for your YouTube video.
Canva for sure. Canva is phenomenal. I mean, like Canva is one of these things. If you used to try Canva like a long time ago, and you're like, oh, it's kind of hard, I'm not a designer, go back to Canva. Canva has like infused all this AI in there. It's absolutely phenomenal. The amount of templates they have. If I pay whatever 11, 12 bucks a month for it or something like that, it is just incredible. But in terms of like the Magic Expand and background remover and things like that, Canva is an absolute joy. I know I'm not alone in saying that, but it's an incredible tool.
Is that the end of the lightning round, Andrew?
That's the end of the lightning round. This was
one.
fantastic. I wasn't familiar with U.com, so I'm going to go look that up.
Yeah, check it out. It's really, really good.
So with all these tools out there, what would you say that companies get wrong about AI?
You know, I think what they actually get wrong is thinking that the tool is the answer. So one of the first questions I used to get asked, and I still get asked to a certain extent, if I go into like, private equity company or insurance company, whatever, like wherever I'm sort of doing training for. And they'll say, so what are the top 10 or what are the top AI tools that you use? And I actually don't even really answer. And I know that sounds a little aggressive, but it's the same reason I don't really do use cases, is that they'll say like, hey, so what are the best use cases for healthcare? And again, I used to tell them the use cases, and then I'd go back later and they'd still be essentially using those use cases. And that's when I realized like this was way more about the brain. That's why all my training and everything is really like mostly about the brain, actually, and how the brain interacts with all this stuff, rather than the problem is in our brain. The problem isn't in the tool. And so what happens is they'll still be using those use cases, and I'll be like, why you're still using, like, what? I mean, like, I Googled those use cases. Like, I don't know anything about healthcare. Like, so that's the weird thing, right? But I think the analogy here is sort of like if you walked in, if you flew to a planet or went to a planet where there was no form of transportation, and you brought like all these, vehicles with you, and you kind of like, the first thing you bring out is a bike, and the guy jumps on the bike, like, this is amazing. And they don't even, because it's faster than they ever thought they could go. And so you've given them these sort of like ways of doing something, and they don't even think to like look, in the rest of the cargo hold that you have, which is like Lamborghinis and jets and things like that. Because they're like, nothing will ever go faster than this bicycle, right? And so what happens in that case is that people sort of like get locked on to use cases. So I think that what happens with all these AI tools is that we are so accustomed to a tool being the answer, right? And so like what tools, like, oh, well, there's Excel and there's Salesforce and there's PowerPoint. All those things do different things. So obviously you would name a lot of different tools just in the Microsoft Office suite, for example. AI doesn't work like that, or generative AI doesn't work like that, because people kind of think like a tool will change behavior. The American economy is built atop the idea that a tool will change behavior. That's why there's all these treadmills gathering dust, right? That's not how it works. Your behavior changes behavior. And so when people ask for tools, they're sort of asking for shortcuts to how to change behavior. And so I refuse. I'm like, look, we're not going to do a lot of tools here. Because I don't use a lot of tools. We're going to just work with ChatGPT. I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to sort of show you how this is going to change your behavior in a lot of different ways, how you use it in a lot of different ways. I do show them Perplexity because I think it's too good not to, or U.com, because it's too good not to show them an alternative to Google search. But so with tools, I actually really minimize the focus on tools, because it's not really about that in my mind. It's about how people interact with the tools that they already have.
And to bring things full circle, I'd like to ask just a maybe basic, maybe complicated question. Your current title is AI architect. What is an AI architect?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So the dean of the school actually came up with this idea, and because we were kind of going back and forth on like what's the title, he's like, I mean, he and the vice dean and sort of like the heads of the school were like, listen, Connor, like, I really want you to consider this title. Like, so I didn't come up with it. And they're like, because this is like what we want to project to the world that we're doing, right? I mean, like, we are taking AI and we're building infrastructure here. We're building infrastructure around how people work. We're building infrastructure about how people work with tools. Like, to be an officer kind of like implies that, like, oh, I'm going to oversee all the AI stuff. But that's not really what we're doing. We have to build this up together. We have to change behavior together. We have to sort of like create a whole new system by which we work. It's really like, it's building something from the ground up. It's one thing if you're like a chief data officer or something, right? There's tons of data. Everybody's working with data, blah, blah, blah. They know how to work with data. Then you're just overseeing something that kind of exists. AI, we're really building it. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're building it from the ground up. There's nothing to I mean, yes, you have machine learning applications if you're a giant software company or something like that. That's not us. That's not a higher ed institution. And so what the idea is that, like, if we're changing behavior, we're building all this kind of stuff. It would be disingenuous, I think, to sort of say like an officer overseeing the AI applications, when that's not what this is about. It's not about a lot of different AI applications. It's about how we change behavior. And so the building of it is the sort of like how we wanted to project how NYU Stern sees this and how NYU Stern is approaching this problem.
Well, Conor, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. You didn't disappoint. I think you are the most most interesting person in the world. So you'll have to let your wife know. Where can people find you?
Thank you for asking. It's very kind. So ConorGrennan.com is probably the easiest place. That's like my hub. And I have a newsletter that goes out. So it's super easy to sign up. You get this phenomenal AI quick start guide as well, which is designed by my friend designer Robert Haslam, which is really spectacular. So that's a good place. I'm also, again, like, I'm on LinkedIn all the time, and I'm on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. Too many places, clearly. But I think the newsletter and sort of signing up there is, obviously it's free, but like, it's great because I think that's where, like, kind of everything else kind of like goes out from. That's like the core of our stuff.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Conor. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and we hope to do it again.
That was awesome. Thank you, guys. I love these questions. That was awesome.